Alright, so you're watching this video because we're not having class tonight. The agenda would be Chapter 15 lecture, take a break, and then Blue Planet Coral Seas. Now, there's a link to the video Coral Seas on Blackboard. It's also on Netflix. It's just one of the episodes from the Blue Planet series. There's a video sheet that goes along with it that I'll expect you to turn in next week. You also have some homework. Your Chapter 16 reading quiz will be due next Wednesday, and your culminating essay is due at the start of the final exam. So you should already have that in your hands, maybe even already working on it. If you need some help, you can go to the Writing Center for some help with editing or doing some research. If you have any other questions, you can definitely email me as well. Chapter 15 is animals of the benthic environment. Last week we had animals of the pelagic environment, the swimmers. This week will be our bottom of the ocean floor dwelling organisms. The main points of this chapter are benthic communities include a variety of habitats. Corals are a specific focus for this chapter. They need very special environmental conditions. And then finally, hydrothermal vents support diverse communities that rely on chemosynthesis. So you have the full range from photosynthesizers in the shallows to the chemosynthesizers in the depths. The distribution of benthic organisms across our planet is tied very closely to the chlorophyll distribution. We talked a couple weeks ago about primary productivity and how that is tied to photosynthesis. There is a connection between the primary productivity and all the different food chains. So you find the most life where you have the photosynthesizers, with the exception of the chemosynthesis that happens at deep sea vents, which is not a major portion. If you look at the coast of the continents here, you can see that the purple colors represent the highest numbers of biomass. So biomass refers to the quantity of life, and you can see that they are off the coasts of the continent. If we were just looking at our country, over off the southwest corner of California, down by the Baja Peninsula, we have a surge in life up along the Aleutian Trench in Alaska, over up into Canada, off the New England coast. And then you can see there's some other kind of hot spots over along Greenland, up in Scandinavia and the Arctic, over near the Kamchatka Peninsula in Siberia. So we do have these zones. There's a lot of productivity in the Arctic cold waters where we have upwelling, bringing up nutrients. Our famous area off the coast of Chile has this as well. And you can see down around Antarctica, there's quite a bit of biomass. Now, the first community we'll look at are the rocky shores. We'll look at other communities as well. We'll just start with our rocky shore communities. This brings up the term epifauna. Epi means the outside. Like the outside of your skin is called the epidermis. So this is like the upper life. Fauna means animals, to be specific. So epifauna are organisms that are attached to rocky surfaces. Like the coast of Maine is a very rocky coast. The coast of Washington State is rocky. And so you find tide pools with barnacles, you find mussels, you find organisms that have to latch on in order to not be washed away or bashed up on shore. You also find organisms that are moving around on the seafloor, not within it, but they are actually touching the seafloor as they move. Things like snails, crabs, lobsters, even some clams or scallops will move around on top of the surface at some points. You find the greatest diversity when it comes to the rocky shores in the tropical latitudes for animals, but you find the greatest diversity of algae in the mid-latitudes. So we have more of the photosynthesizing at the mid-latitudes, and we have more animal diversity, like our coral reefs, in the tropics. Here we see the intertidal zonation. So we have different zones here. You can see on the left side, numbers 1 through 4. Number 1's the spray zone. The spray zone is an area that's going to get kind of splashed with strong waves, but it's outside of the tide range, so it's never going to be completely submerged except for in a very bad storm. The high tide zone spends quite a bit of the day exposed. The middle tide zone does get covered during tides or during high tide, but is exposed during low tide. And then the low tide zone obviously is submerged except for at the lowest tide. The supratidal zone is supra means above. So outside the tidal zone, in the spray zone, we have organisms that need waves to avoid drying out. So you can see these periwinkles here, they pull up tightly into their shells. We have a rock louse, which is very common in the spray zone, and it has a chitin shell to keep its insides moist, much like those roly-poly bugs or other insects that we have up on drylands where we live. They need to keep from drying out. You don't have a lot of algae here because the algae, for the most part, needs to stay wet in order to stay hydrated and not dry out. In the high tide zone, we have thick-celled plants. We have animals with shells, not necessarily animals that move around. Sometimes they do though. These limpets could move around, but they have these nice pyramid-shaped shells in order to protect themselves from strong waves and to protect themselves from drying out during low tide. You can see this rockweed looks like it has some, it's hardier. That's because it spends some of its time exposed to the sun, and so it has to resist drying out completely and kind of burning in the sun. In the middle tide zone, we have a chitin over on the left, which is a really unusual creature. If you've never heard of a chitin, go find a YouTube video, go look up a chitin. I would be, well, I've seen one, and it was pretty impressive. It was off the coast in Hawaii, up on some rocks in the middle tide zone, but they kind of have an iridescent pearly surface that doesn't really look like an animal at all. It just looks like a fascinating rock. Over on the right, we have those barnacles again. The barnacles are animals that live inside these shells that look like little volcanoes, and they can kind of lock up tight when they need to keep the water in, keep the sun out. In the middle tide zone, we also have starfish, we have snails, we have mussels. So a lot of things you would associate with the coast. If you ever go to a zoo or an aquarium, they might have a touch tank with anemones and starfish and different clams and things. That's generally the middle tide zone. These organisms are accustomed to being dry or wet. Here we have a thick black mussel bed. Those mussels would be submerged during high tide, but they hang on tight during low tide. Over on the right, we have a starfish actually eating a mussel, pulls it in, has kind of its guts on the inside, and it'll exude them right up into the shell and digest the organism, and then absorb the nutrients back in through the same hole its guts went out. These are sea anemone. Anemone are something you may touch in a tide pool. There's something you may touch in one of those touch tanks at aquariums or zoos. They are very similar to coral polyps. If you look at the diagram on the left, it's extremely similar to what we see when we zoom in on corals. And tonight's video is on coral, so you'll see the similarity there. Over on the far right, we have a bigger anemone. They have stinging nematocysts on their tentacles. So their tentacles will sting anything that tries to eat it. But there are some fish, called clownfish, that are immune to it. They have kind of a mucus on their skin. So they can live within the anemone and they don't get stung, and they'll keep the anemone safe from predators. So they have a symbiotic relationship. They protect each other. Here we have a hermit crab, which will definitely move around. We saw a video last week of a hermit, or 2 weeks ago, of crabs kind of competing for a new shell after a very big snail ate a smaller snail and then kind of popped out that empty shell, and the crabs all fought over who got to move in next. They do have a soft body, so that's why they're always grabbing a shell to keep their delicate parts safe. The sea urchins below kind of look like balls of spikes, but they are able to move about on those spikes. They have a mouth. They hunt. Interesting thing to try to watch them mate. You can YouTube that too if you're interested. Now when we get to the low tide zone, we start to see a lot more of the photosynthesizers. We get to see a lot more of the delicate organisms that are mostly protected by the water, except for at the very lowest tide. So here we have a tide pool on the left. There's usually water down in the basin of it, but the edges may dry out. So the animals will kind of tuck down into the water during low tide. There's some algae in that picture. And then over on the right, we definitely have some of the seagrasses that were in our chapter 2 weeks ago. Here's some shore crabs, not to be confused with the hermit crabs. These ones grow their own hard shell. They do molt, so as they grow, when they get too tight in their shell, they'll actually pop off their shell and be soft for a bit before their new shell will harden. And if you catch them at the right time, they're called soft shell crabs, and people just fry them up and eat them, just eating that shell and all because it's still soft. That eventually will be a hard shell, which will protect them from drying out and protect them from predators. So this chart just kind of sums up what we were looking at, showing the intertidal zonation, showing common organisms, but you notice that this one is not a rocky shore. This is a sandy beach. So we have different organisms. We have a slightly different shape to the shore here. We really do have the same zones though. The supertidal, here called the back shore, is the same as our spray zone. It's the area where tides don't really go, but storms could push waves. The subtidal zone there just means it's below where the low tide is, so the water will never retreat from that zone. Everyone that lives in the subtidal zone will always have water on them. You can see here, it says sediment size is related to wave and current strength, meaning if you have very strong currents or very strong waves, large boulders can be moved around. But if you have very gentle water, hardly moving at all, you'll end up with the finest grained sediments like mudflats, which are made up of the tiniest particles, clays and silts. Now in the intertidal zone, we find a lot of, oops, I went back, sorry. Now here we go, our sandy beach organisms and adaptations. So we have annelid worm here, two different pictures. It's a fascinating worm. It's very different than the worms that we find in our dirt in our gardens here. These are segmented worms, and it makes a burrow that's kind of a U shape. And it eats the sand, passes through its digestive system, and kind of gets its nutrition that way. So in a way, it's a bit of a filter feeder. This is an example of an infauna. Epifauna was on top of the ground surface. Infauna live within the ground. So they can move around. They don't necessarily always stay in the same place, but because they are protected by sediments, they're less likely to dry out during low tide. It's a good way to hide from predators unless you have something like a dolphin that can kind of blow the sand away and find you. Another great example of an infauna is a bivalve mollusk. Bivalve, bi means two, Bivalve refers to the two shells that are hinged and fold together. So here we have a clam. Clams, oysters, mussels, scallops, they're all bivalves with two different shells. The shell obviously protects the soft's inside to keep it from drying out, keep it safe from predators, and for the most part, these are filter feeders. Not always, but a lot of times they'll pull water through and just kind of take nutrients right from the water. This clam here is putting a foot right out of its shell. Doesn't look like your foot or my foot, but it's the clam's foot, and it uses it to dig down into the sand. Now this is a great picture now, but I found a video that demonstrates this, so I'm going to switch over to the video. Alright, now there is not really sound for this video, but it's still pretty interesting to watch. There's that foot coming out, it's thinking about burrowing down. This is an aquarium burrowing clam. So this is in an aquarium. It's not out in the open ocean. You can see it's kind of picking up some of those little sand grains, and there's definitely fish in the background. So it's finally dug its foot down deep enough that it's starting to pull itself right into the sand. And there you're going to get a good look at the hinge of the clam. You can see some of its filters kind of sticking out from the side there. They look like little hairs. And this is real time, so you can see it's not necessarily the quickest. There are some clams that are very quick. This one's not really in danger, so it's not working too desperately to bury itself, but it is burying itself. So you see, sometimes in nature videos, you'll see bears or other mammals digging through the sand, digging through the mud to get clams out. People who collect clams to sell in markets, they know exactly where to go to dig them out. They'll watch for the bubbles, watch for the kind of the dent in the sand, exactly where those clams are, so that they can collect them when the tide goes down. Here's an example of a crustacean. You can see we have things like sand crabs, lobsters, crayfish. These are all organisms that have an exoskeleton, so a skeleton on the outside, usually made of chitin, usually having jointed limbs. Usually these are organisms that are going to molt as they grow, losing their outer shell, having a dangerous soft time when they're very vulnerable to drying out and to predators. But crustaceans can get quite large if they're not hunted. They do often bury themselves in sand. You usually find them in the shallower water during certain parts of the year, and then in the deeper water for the winter. Here's an example of echinoderms. We have two different echinoderms here. We have a starfish on the right, the purple starfish looking like a star. Over on the left, we have a heart urchin. Sea urchins are the ones that look like spiky balls. Well, this one looks kind of like a Valentine heart if you look at it from the top view, and it digs itself down into the sand, so it's an infauna, and then it puts out a respiratory channel so that it can breathe and get water. You can see it's got its own sanitary channel where it kind of makes its own little bathroom off to the side, and this one is a filter feeder as well. Echinoderms generally have 5 different segments. The echinoderm name comes from this spiky skin. The next category are myofauna. Myo meaning very tiny. These are microscopic. You wouldn't necessarily see these with your eyes. If you look here, we have a nematode head, an amphipod, and a polychaete worm. And all of these are 1 millimeter or smaller. So they are very tiny organisms. They feed on bacteria. They live in the sand generally, but they could live outside of the sand as well. And they come in lots of different categories of life. The term myofauna just describes how small they are. Now this video is just a dish with myofauna. So these are sand grains, and you can see there's a lot of tiny organisms wiggling around in here. And there's not really any narration, but you can see there are different worms, different amphipods. There are even some mollusks in here, tiny shelled organisms. These are the things that you would probably drink in if you were swimming in the ocean and you got thirsty. Not necessarily recommended. Now that you've seen this video, probably less likely to be enticing to you. You can see that tongue-like thing there is part of a clam that was rooting around, maybe even trying to bury itself in the sand, but doesn't really have anywhere to go because it's inside a petri dish. So there's just so much life in these sand grains. This could be sand just like if you went to the beach and scooped it up. To your eyes, you just have a bunch of tiny rocks, but under a microscope, you see all this life. I'm going to jump ahead a smidge because at about the 2-minute mark, they kind of zoom in a little more, and you can see, oh, that's the part where they zoom back out. But there's a part where they zoom in on a bivalve, and I think it's interesting to see its little foot wiggling around there. So this is the bivalve. Well, here's another bivalve. You can see its foot reaching out, trying to scoot across the petri dish, maybe even trying to find a place to bury in. So I guess one of the takeaways I guess I'd like you to have from this class is really if you're reading a book and you're looking at pictures of organisms and you've never seen them or heard of them, look it up on the internet because there's some really interesting videos about what life is doing that you really can't get from pictures, PowerPoints, or textbooks. Those were our sandy beach organisms. Now, just real quick about our mud flats. Our mud flats are zones where there's very little water movement. You would find mud flats down in the Gulf of Mexico. You find quite a bit in the tropics. These are areas where you don't have strong tides. You do have a lot of eelgrass and turtle grass, so you have these long grasses that are growing, photosynthesizing. You have a lot of the infauna, the bivalves, the other mollusks that may dig down into the mud, or maybe even some that'll kind of sit on the surface. But here, because it's not rocky, they're not really attaching themselves. The epifauna have the potential to move around. Here we have a fiddler crab with its large claw, and then it has its tiny claw, but it only needs one for its fiddling. The subtidal zone in the offshore ocean communities is generally going to be rocky. So once we get below the tide zone, we don't really have the sand or the mud. Now we have a rocky bottom, regardless of what kind of coast it is. And in this zone, you're going to find kelp. Now, we watched a video where kelp forests provided shelter for sea otters, and the sea otters protected the kelp by eating the predators, the urchins and snails. It was debatable. Some of you thought that the otters were the keystone species. Others of you thought that the kelp was the keystone species. I would say that those of you who said the kelp's the keystone species were more on target. Because if the kelp is gone, the otters, the urchins, the snails will be gone. If the otters go, the kelp and the snail will probably decimate the kelp down. So it is a delicate balance. But the kelp really is the photosynthesizers, and they tend to be the keystone species. So as we saw in that video, these kelp attach themselves to the rocks at the bottom with the holdfast, and they have these gas bubbles called pneumatocysts that help them to float. They have very wide leaves that kind of help add surface area so that they can stay floating, and also to catch sunlight for photosynthesizing. Here we have a picture of kelp forest. This one doesn't have any sea otters, but it definitely has a lot of fish. It provides a great nursery for all kinds of life, also feeding grounds. So just like you think of a coral reef as kind of the rainforest of the ocean with a lot of diversity, a lot of different life forms, same thing with our kelp forest. There are different zones. Coral won't necessarily be as deep. The kelp can withstand a little more of a rough wave environment. They do grow very fast. They hold on tight. They have the ability to float. So we find a lot of kelp on the west coast. Here's our kelp. These are the kelp with the air bladders. So the ones we saw in the video, the ones we've talked about. Over on the west coast, you see them down on the west coast of South America as well. You see the shrub kelp, the ones that aren't necessarily as tall, don't necessarily have the floating bladders, on the east coast. So if you went to the rocky coast of Maine, you would find a lot of shorter kelp, thick cellulose bodies, very hardy, but wouldn't necessarily be 30 meters tall. In the same areas where we may find kelp, we might also find our lobster communities. Here we have two types. On the left is the spiny lobster. You find those in the Caribbean. You find them on the west coast, so there'd be a California lobster. On the right, we have the American lobster, which is also called the Maine lobster, found in the New England area. Both of them tend to live in deeper water, but they may come up to shallow waters to spawn, take care of their babies. We saw lobsters fighting over nesting grounds a couple weeks ago, and we saw the mother lobster release all of her tiny lobster children at once. Here we see oysters. It just kind of looks like gray rocks, but actually those are all organisms that are just tightly packed in the rocky, this would be within the tide zone. You can see where the water line is between the dark and the light. The light ones are more dried out. They have a very thick shell to protect themselves. Oyster beds are harvested by humans, by different mammals, by starfish, and sometimes you end up getting a pearl from an oyster. One of the biggest predators for an oyster is a drill snail. You can see in the top picture, the snail is just moving along the oyster shell. Now the snail may be very small, maybe bigger. Oysters can keep growing as long as they're allowed to survive. It'll always live in its same shell. So as long as it's living, it'll keep adding layers to the edge of its shell. Now the snail has something called a radula, which you might think of as like a little saw. And it's going to keep scraping on the shell until it makes a depression. It removes the outer tough coating of the shell, and then it'll put in some acid. And shells are made of calcium, and calcium carbonate dissolves from acid. So once it's weakening the shell, it can just put some acid in, which will dissolve down and then make a hole to the body of the oyster, and the snail can just suck out the insides. It can digest them with some enzymes and then suck out the meat and have oyster dinner. Sometimes you will find oyster shells or other bivalve shells with little holes in it. That's what causes them as snails. Now, coral reefs are very specific focus to this chapter. It's what the movie is about tonight. Coral reefs are shallow water communities. Traditionally, they've been thought to be restricted to the tropics, but in reality, we have found some coral reefs in colder environments. They're still being studied, so they're not a major focus for this textbook at this point in time. You can see how these polyps here do look very much like our anemones that are in the same family. Each of these little orange tufts is a coral animal. We call it a polyp if it's individual, If it's a whole community all living together, we just call it a coral. And there are many types of coral. As you can see in this picture, we have different body plans, we have different colors. Some look a little more soft, some look a little more rocky. But for the most part, these coral need to be in clear, calm water so that photosynthesis can occur. If it's very turbid, if there's a lot of mixing of the water, then sand or mud could block the sun from shining down on the coral. They get their colors from an algae that lives inside of them. The algae is called zooxanthellae, zoo meaning animal. Zooxanthellae photosynthesize the sun's light and provide nutrition to the coral, and the coral provides a home to the zooxanthellae. So they do need each other. The coral will starve without the algae, and the algae won't be able to live without the coral. If there's not enough photosynthesis, so the sun gets blocked out from pollution, from an underwater avalanche, something causing the sun not to be able to shine down on the coral, the zooxanthellae may die off. If the water temperatures change too much, if they get too warm, the zooxanthellae will kind of panic and eject themselves from the coral. All of this leaves the coral behind. It can't leave, so the coral itself will die off, and we call that bleaching because the color comes from the algae. So without it, now we just have white coral, and once the polyps are dead, we're left with this rocky limestone. And if you ever pick up coral like in an aquarium shop, or you see it, I don't know, for a souvenir up on the beach, that rocky coral you're holding doesn't have any life in it. It's what's left over after the coral bleaching, after the zooxanthellae are gone and the coral has died off. Here we have a diagram showing the conditions for coral reef development. The different colors represent the number of reef-building coral genera. So the warmest colors, like the red, where it says above 50, represent that you've the highest diversity of coral. Purple indicates the lowest diversity. And anything that's outside of the rainbow here is an area where the water is just too cold. Or it could be too turbid. Maybe you have a lot of upwelling, so there's too much nutrients in the water, and photosynthesis can't occur. So if you're really looking for some good coral, the best place to go would be off the coast of Australia, where you go find the Great Barrier Reef. But that whole area on the west side of the Pacific is great because normally we have very strong trade winds pushing all the warm water to the west side of the Pacific, making it just right for coral development. We find a similar thing on the west side of the Indian Ocean. The Atlantic's not great for coral because it never gets that warm. It's just not that big of an ocean. And it's got a lot of mixing from the polar waters. All right, so I did mention already about the coral and the algae having a symbiotic relationship where they help each other. We call this eating style for the coral mixotroph. They derive part of their nutrition from the algae. The algae's on the inside, it gives it color. In this picture, we have kind of yellowy orange tentacles, and you can see the coral's body is kind of a reddish color. The algae on the inside are actually giving it that color, and they're photosynthesizing and giving the coral food. There are other types of coral called hermatypic coral that are much more dependent on the algae. So two different types. One's more dependent on the algae to provide food. One needs some of the food from the algae but can make its own food. The ones that are more mixotroph are going to be deeper down, and they're the ones that aren't really shown here in your textbook because they're more recently discovered. But you can see there's a lot of other things in the coral reef that get some of their nutrition from the algae, like mollusks, bivalves, sponges, foraminifera, and these will feed on the coral and actually be predators to the coral. Here we have a coral reef on the left. You can see there's kind of a background of coral, and there's two different types of sponges there. Sponges are really unique organisms. They're kind of like coral, where it's not just one big organism, but a whole community all living together as one plant-like structure. Cool thing about a sponge is if you push it through a screen, like a window screen, it will actually reform on the other side because it's made up of tiny organisms that all live together. Over on the right, we have a giant clam, just for fun. Giant clams also have algae on the inside, and you can see there's a bunch of different coral in the background. Within a coral reef, we see different types of coral, different organisms at different levels. In the top zone here, we have the most photosynthesis, but we also have the most potential for rough waves, for storms. So we end up with more robust corals up in the top zone, maybe in the lagoon, maybe over on the reef crest. They're going to be stronger, hardier to withstand the wave action. Down further below, we don't have as much turbulence. We also don't have as much photosynthesizer. Down further below, we may have some of the coral that don't necessarily get 100% of the nutrition from the algae. We may have coral that are a little more feathery or twig-like, not as hardy because they don't need to be, because there's not very much wave action. And then when we get down below 150 meters, we really don't see living corals. Instead, we see leftover coral reach from a time when sea level was lower. And so this whole zone would have shifted down. Or in the case of this picture, we're looking at a volcano that has changed sea level in that area through volcanism and uplift. Coral reefs are considered to be the rainforest of the ocean. They are very important for fish, for mammals, for mollusks, for bivalves, and of course, they're important to the coral. The largest living structure on our planet would be the Great Barrier Reef. And one of the culminating essay questions is about the future of the Great Barrier Reef. And you have to decide, is it safe? Is it dead? Is it declining? Is it stagnant? What's going on with it? Because you see a lot of different reports of the news depending on which news source you go to. These coral reefs do quite a bit for providing a home for organisms, feeding grounds, nursing grounds, breeding grounds, and so on. But they're also very important for economics, providing locations for fishing, for tourism, and just for enhancing life in areas where you find reefs. So they are important, and they are delicate. They are very sensitive to temperature changes with global warming. They're very sensitive to pollution, to being touched, to having sunscreen in the water. So there's a lot of restrictions if you're going to a coral reef as a tourist about how you can and can't interact with the coral. Over on the right here, we have one of those deep down corals. Generally, you don't see these ones so much in the picture. You see the hardier, rockier corals. Maybe a brain coral that's more rounded, or a branch coral. This coral is actually more soft, and it can kind of flow around in the water, and its tentacles, the polyp tentacles, will be longer to catch some nutrients because it's not going to thrive entirely off of photosynthesis. One of the big threats to our coral reef communities that's not a human threat is the crown of thorns, which is a sea star, so like a starfish, and it eats the coral polyps, and it just kind of scoots around the reef, munching on the coral, which definitely kills them, and it doesn't seem to have any natural predator. So it's an invasive species in coral reef communities. Coral reef bleaching is something I've touched on about If the zooxanthellae leave, then the coral themselves turn white. There are several causes for why this could happen, but the number one cause that's bleaching the most corals on our planet right now is climate change, increasing surface temperatures in the water. And here we have a kind of a before on the left and an after on the right. So it's the same zone. You can see on the left, there's some depth to the coral. It's got some color variations. It looks more alive. And then over on the right, it looks like bones. It's white and dead looking. Our coral reefs are in decline. In 2000, they were 41% healthy, and now we're down to 30% healthy. So our coral reefs have definitely suffered over the last almost 20 years here. And, 41% healthy is nothing to be excited about either. So even by the year 2000, the corals on our planet were in trouble. This is the Great Barrier Reef. So this is off the coast of Australia. And remember, there's kind of three stages of a coral reef formation. Starts off as a fringing reef, and then you have the barrier reef, and eventually if the land subsides completely underwater, then you have an atoll. And this won't happen in the case of the Great Barrier Reef because Australia is not going anywhere, but we do have this sort of a protective zone, and that's one thing I didn't mention earlier about why they're important. This coral reef actually kind of breaks waves and dampens storms that are washing onto the shore of Australia or other areas with barrier reefs. So humans are the greatest threat. The crown of thorns is definitely a threat, but there are natural threats to coral reefs as well. Climate change does happen naturally. We've had maybe as many as 9 ice ages in the past on our planet. We definitely have hurricanes every year. We definitely have floods. If you have a flood coming off of the land, it can cause a lot of turbulence, which stops the photosynthesis. You can also have sea level temporarily rise. This could happen from a tsunami as well. And the coral will just be too deep, or the water may be too cold or too dirty for the coral to survive. So that is all the bad news about corals. And now we move on to kind of our last topic. Our last topic are the deep ocean floor communities. I'm actually going to pause for a moment and stop this video, start another video. So if you want to take a break and watch the Blue Planet Coral movie and then come back and finish it up with the deep ocean, that would make sense to me. Otherwise, you can just start the next video right away.